Вот стоим.
Вообще похеру. Вы не на того напали.
Смотрите.
Рассказывать мне, блядь, описывать.
Russia's elites have begun turning on Putin, admitting out loud that the war is lost. And the whispers in the Kremlin's corridors are now giving way to open betrayal against him. While what this war has brought Moscow shakes the deepest foundations of Russian society from within. On July 2nd, State Duma Committee Chair Nina Ostanina accused Putin's government, in remarks posted to Telegram, of hiding the truth from the public. In a dictatorship where opposition is silenced instantly and a single voice is the law, a figure from the highest level of parliament standing up and accusing her own cabinet of lying is no ordinary political criticism. In the order Putin built, this amounts to betrayal. It is an open flag of mutiny from elites who have begun abandoning a sinking ship. Ostanina compressed the abyss the regime is sliding toward into one lethal sentence. The country could be left without bread. Under sanctions, that is the equivalent of death. There is a single word in Russian history that has toppled empires, brought down crowns, and put czars in front of firing squads: bread. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 didn't begin with grand political manifestos. It began with the cries of the hungry, furious working class standing in bread queues on the streets of Petrograd. Today, a full 107 years later, the footsteps of that same nightmare echo through the cold, gilded corridors of the Kremlin. The war has stopped being an abstract red arrow on a map. It has come down directly into the kitchen of the Russian working class, into their wallets, and all the way to Putin's chair. So why have the regime's elites suddenly started abandoning ship and turning the bill on one another? They know exactly what the scent of betrayal is, the sound of an approaching popular revolt. This admission shows that the war has left the distant frontline headline behind and reached the supermarket shelf and the bank queue. We'll trace how far this admission reaches, from the pump to the harvest, from the harvest to the bank, and on to the ballot box. But first, a small request. The algorithm has been suppressing independent analysis like this, and the video isn't reaching the people it should. Subscribing, liking, and leaving even a single word in the comments helps us break through it. It takes seconds. Now let's look at exactly what that admission contained. Ostanina's warning is not an angry outburst thrown out before an election. It is a concrete alarm. By her account, nearly a third of Russia's largest refineries are out of action. The Deputy Prime Minister and the ministers responsible aren't describing the situation honestly, and no emergency plan exists. Putin, meanwhile, waves the same crisis away in public as not critical. So while the Kremlin transmits the message that there is no problem, the regime's own lawmaker declares that same picture a disaster. It matters to grasp that this is no ordinary opposition salvo. Duma elections come in September, and Ostanina openly hinted that this fuel and bread problem could cost certain officials their seats. The crisis has stopped being purely economic and turned into a direct political threat. What we're seeing is anger that has been building for months finally surfacing. Russian lawmakers are wrestling with the complaints coming out of their districts: expensive bread, empty filling stations, late wages. In a single-voiced system like Russia's, this is a turning point. A committee chair is openly accusing the government of concealing the truth. The crack is deep, and the pressure is far greater than assumed. In short, the one uttering the word defeat is no longer an enemy. It is the system's own voice. Ostanina isn't the only one raising it. Even the man at the very top of the Duma, Speaker Vyacheslav Volodin, stepped in with a public appeal.
Если соберем волю каждого.
If we unite everyone's will into a single will, we will prevail. We all understand that the collective West is against us. We must proceed on that basis and not give them any excuse, or let them look for one. We'll handle the problems at gas stations, just as we've handled other problems. They wanted to bring down our financial system. They failed.
He went further still, boasting that the West tried to bring down both the financial system and the economy, and failed. Reality says the opposite. In the very days those words were spoken, refineries were falling offline one by one, petrol was being rationed, and the banks were being quietly dragged toward a devastating threshold. So the boast that they couldn't break us hangs in the air in the shadow of the very breakdown it denies. The answer lies in the harvest fields. July is the very heart of Russia's harvest. This year, though, farmers can't find diesel, and the price of fuel has doubled. With no diesel to run the tractor, the grain stays in the field, and even once it's cut, moving it to the mill takes a truck, which takes fuel again. Fuel sits in every link of the chain. Robert Brovdy, commander of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, better known as Magyar, sums the picture up in one line. The harvest across southern Russia is being crushed under a severe fuel crisis, and the rising price of diesel has made even hauling the grain uneconomical. Scarcity travels fast from there down to the dinner table. By independent accounts, the 2026 harvest is already 1 to 2 weeks behind. Food producers are warning retailers about delivery delays. Hauliers raised freight rates by at least 10% from July 1st, and every marked-up truck eventually lands on the shelf price. And once the price of bread starts moving in a country, the matter stops being economic and becomes social, which is precisely why the Kremlin is treading so carefully. This is exactly the domino Ostanina meant when she said, death. The quietest front of this economic siege opens not in the street, but at the very heart of the financial system, since the admission didn't come from the Duma alone. The same fear was voiced by the head of Russia's largest bank. Here the story moves from the stomach to the wallet. Sberbank CEO German Gref said on state television on June 30th that there is no one left in this country whose greatest wish isn't for the war to end as soon as possible. The American press ran it under the headline that Putin's top banker is begging for the war to end. Sberbank's chief didn't stop there. Calling the central bank's rate policy all but irrational, he said the economy has been overcooled and could even contract in 2026. That warning, though, is only the first signal of a far darker picture. Even Kremlin-linked economists now speak of a banking crisis threshold that has been crossed. By CMASF, that threshold is defined two ways: problem assets exceeding 10% or a mass flight of deposits. Yet by the end of 2025, 11% of corporate loans, a sum topping 10 trillion rubles, were already problematic, and among small firms, the share climbed to 19%. Households are in the same swamp. Non-performing personal debt has passed $30 billion. The Institute, which for now rates the odds of a crisis as moderate, points to autumn 2026 as the genuinely dangerous window. And the institution saying all this is no bystander. Sberbank is the backbone of Russian finance and one of the banks closest to the state. Its chief calling for an end to the war on state television shows, all by itself, how far the unease inside the regime now runs. Sberbank also recently cut its corporate lending outlook. As bad debts pile up, the bank is turning cautious about issuing new credit, which means a fresh, vicious circle. Tighter credit strained companies generate more bad debt, and that makes the bank warier still. From a distance, all these numbers can look like a problem for bankers and bureaucrats alone. The real question is this: what does this picture amount to in an ordinary Russian's life? By analysts' reading, the most striking place to look is the budget. Russia borrowed hundreds of billions of dollars at crushing rates to finance the war. Today, servicing the interest alone costs more than the country's entire health budget, and runs to nearly 1.5 times what it spends on education. Put differently, every interest payment now competes directly with a hospital, a school, a pension. Faced with that choice, the Kremlin always picks the same side: the front, not the people. Which is why the war has reached the Russian family's dinner table. People know it now not from the news, but from their own kitchens, since we're now coming to the part of this picture that has alarmed even Western intelligence: the devastating threshold the banks are being dragged toward. The most striking example of this came from the Samara region. On April 30th, a video that exploded across social media showed Russian women stepping directly in front of cameras and unleashing an unprecedented rage against the Russian leader.
They are sending us to garages filled with gasoline and cars. They're shoving us into these basements, and I am deeply convinced that everyone, starting from the president, must be removed from office.
The women are naming Putin directly, telling him, "You go live in the basement," and openly demanding the president's resignation. In Russia, such explicit, on-camera, name-calling criticism is extremely rare. This was a clear indication that the people had openly declared war on the regime. In reality, the people's demands were very basic: security, enough income to survive, and peace. But as the Russian economy entered a serious freefall, state institutions had become unable to meet even the most basic social needs. The war had now reached the windows of ordinary Russian citizens in all its brutal reality. When people began spending their daily lives in fear of death, in makeshift flooded shelters, their patience was exhausted. Look, in those same days, a Russian citizen from Tuapse was rising up on social media, dramatically questioning the Putin regime.
I'm not afraid of NATO right now. It's leaving the house that scares me. The sirens are wailing, it's raining oil, and you can't see the sun through the smoke. It's pretty much exactly how I imagined the bright future under our government's leadership.
The Tuapse refinery had been struck for the fourth time in 2 weeks, including on May 1st, 2026. The city was caught between security and ecological disaster, and the regime had been silent for days. And look, let's return to that hair-raising video from Samara. The woman in the black jacket directly challenges,
Where is our shelter? Tell me. Why are you putting us in the basement? Go, Mr. Putin. To the basement yourself.
This is the most naked face of the regime's indifferent and humiliating attitude toward its own people. For them, this is not a simple matter of inadequate shelters. It is deliberate negligence and a crime from start to finish. The state mechanism had already collapsed long before the war decision was made, but officials looked the other way. Failing to foresee that the war would spill onto Russian soil once the operation began, or being caught unprepared for it, was sheer stupidity. Leaving the people this defenseless is no longer a simple mistake. It is seen as an open crime. This is why the women are putting forward the harshest demand. Starting with the president, all governors, mayors, the entire administrative chain must immediately be removed. They must resign. They are throwing the reality of "we are dying here" in their faces, and openly declaring that no one will ever silence their voices again. These words go far beyond an ordinary complaint. They are one of the most powerful objections, showing that the people's patience with the regime has burst, and the voice of "enough" has descended to the streets. Moreover, the Russian people are not alone in their criticism. In this war they have launched against the regime. Famous Russian influencer Victoria Bonya addressed Putin directly in an 18-minute Instagram video. She said, "The people are afraid of you. Governors are not telling the truth. The economy and internet restrictions are a disaster." And she added, "Between you and us ordinary people, there is a huge, thick wall." The video went viral with millions of views, but the criticism was not confined to social media influencers. It spread to official state institutions and regional councils. The objections rising in parliamentary corridors are no longer whispered behind closed doors. On April 22nd, a Duma deputy addressed Putin directly.
We've told you Putin 10 times. The economy is bound to collapse. The first quarter was a complete disaster. If you don't take immediate action, financial, economic, and otherwise, then in the fall we'll face what happened in 1917.
1917. In the fourth year of World War I, prolonged trench warfare and economic collapse had led to the February Revolution. A Duma deputy drawing this parallel is not random. This is an alarm coming from within the system. In fact, the roots of these bold outbursts run much deeper and are structural in nature. The spark of this courage was struck months earlier in Putin's hometown of St. Petersburg, in the Smolninskoye Municipal Council. This local council went beyond mere political criticism. It submitted an official petition to the State Duma, shattering Russia's greatest taboo. They demanded Putin's removal from office on charges of treason for the war in Ukraine. Moreover, these council members did not resort to emotional slogans. They presented 4 fundamental arguments based on the regime's own constitution. These arguments were the army's destruction, demographic catastrophe, economic collapse, and strategic defeat. They knew the Duma would never try Putin. Their aim was to light a torch in the darkness, and they said it. The real crisis behind this reaction is the massive bankruptcy of the state's civil defense infrastructure. According to current reports published by Ukraine's Foreign Intelligence Service, 67% of civil defense shelters across Russia are unusable. Geolocated data from the field and local telegram channels document that a significant portion of shelters in Tatarstan, Belgorod, and even Moscow's outskirts have been locked with rusty padlocks. Those that are open are flooded with sewage or groundwater due to infrastructure failures, corroded pipe systems, and years of neglect. Efforts to modernize the warning system have encountered delays and are not expected to be completed before 2028. So, the situation is this. Ukrainian drones are reaching deep into Russia, sirens are blaring, factories are burning, but the people have nowhere to shelter. Right in the middle of this crisis, the fact that demands for private underground shelters from wealthy elites, bureaucrats and oligarchs in Moscow and St. Petersburg have recently surged by 140% proves the asymmetric decay within the system and how class division has reached a lethal dimension. The systematic collapse of Russia's air defense network has transformed this shelter crisis from a simple infrastructure problem into a direct matter of life and death for millions. In particular, the complete ineffectiveness of S-400 batteries, Nebo SVU early warning radars, and Pantsir S-1 short-range protection systems against Ukraine's electronic warfare-supported asymmetric technologies has left the rear front defenseless. Advanced Western analyses show that 40 to 50 critical air defense units are being wiped out on a regular monthly basis on the front line and beyond borders. This heavy equipment loss has weakened the defense umbrella around the capital and left cities deep in the interior practically naked against swarms of threats from the sky. The sophisticated operations carried out one after another by Ukraine's unmanned systems forces definitively document that even Russia's geography at depths of 1,500 to 2,000 kilometers is no longer a safe, peaceful rear area. Now, even the Z blog writers who had been propagandizing the system for years have reached the point where they cannot deny the current reality. Z blogger Yevgeny Golman screamed his desperation. "We're ruined, completely ruined. 80% of my friends have shut down their businesses. The system has collapsed. They are lying to Vladimir Vladimirovich, and they continue to lie." Golman's use of the irony, "if only the Tsar knew, he would fix everything," is Russia's oldest lament pattern. But now people are beginning to understand that the Tsar knows and simply does not care. The sharp decline in public support rates also confirms this strategic checkmate. According to VTSIOM data, Putin's approval rating has dropped to 65.6%, the lowest level since the start of the Ukraine invasion. The trust rating has declined to 71%, and the decline has been continuing for 7 consecutive weeks. Independent analysts indicate the real figure may be even lower, because in an authoritarian country, people are hesitant to express their true thoughts, even in surveys. Former deputy and one-time presidential candidate Boris Nadezhdin summarizes this shift. People are beginning to understand that there is a direct connection between their daily problems, healthcare, food prices, internet issues, and Vladimir Putin's policies. This is a new situation in Russia. For years, Russians thought if Putin knew, he would fix it. Now they are beginning to understand that the source of the problem is Putin himself. And history is full of cautionary examples. In World War I, prolonged trench warfare and economic collapse had led to the February Revolution of 1917. The Tsar thought his power was solid. Within a few months, he was toppled. The Afghanistan War had worn down the Soviet system over a decade. Even without a direct uprising, it contributed to the collapse. Prigozhin's 2023 march was short-lived, but it had shown how fragile the system was. Even a parallel military force marching on Moscow was possible.
Do you know how poor we've all become? I decided to do the math this morning. I used only the official raw stat inflation data from the beginning of 2022 to April 2026, and it came out to almost 44%. 44% is how poor we've all become, how much our earnings have devalued. So, if you're earning 100,000 rubles now, it's the same as if you were earning 56,000 rubles at the end of 2021. Now ask yourself, how many of us have increased our earnings by 44% over the years, just to stay the same, just to afford the same things we had 4 years ago? Now let public sector workers ask themselves, which public sector workers got their salaries raised by 44% for this?
Analysts say the probability of a full uprising is currently low. But even if Russians cannot launch a mass rebellion, through complaint videos shared on social media, they can very clearly show that discontent and anger are rising. Behind the Russians' rage are concrete numbers, and these numbers are shattering the Kremlin's strong economy narrative. Today in Russia, 100,000 rubles is equivalent to 56,000 rubles in 2021. In 4 years, salaries have lost nearly half their value. To maintain the previous standard of living, salaries would have needed to increase several times over, but they did not. The labour reserve has dropped from 7 million to 4.4 million in 4 years. A large portion of working-age men have either joined the army or left the country. Those remaining have been redirected to the defence industry. 73% of businesses are experiencing serious personnel shortages, and 2 million new workers are needed every year until 2030. But traditional sources like migrant workers from Central Asia are also declining. Manufacturing, construction, oil and gas, logistics, the sectors that form any country's economic backbone. When workers cannot be found in these sectors, production stops, supply chains break, projects collapse. Russia's war economy is actually draining the civilian economy's blood. Every worker attracted to the military and defense sector with high wages is locking the door of a factory or construction site. Central Bank Governor Elvira Nabiullina has acknowledged the severity. Such a situation has never been seen in Russia's modern history, and this situation is affecting the entire economic picture. And the economic collapse is not just in the numbers, it is in people's daily lives. In the Belgorod region, the compensation fund for civilian casualties has completely run out. The answer given to a woman requesting compensation for her burned car and destroyed garage was short. There is no money left in the fund. Deputy Governor Olga Medvedeva delivered this answer officially. Previously, a citizen had been asked to send photos of their damaged vehicle to a blocked Telegram channel, for which they first needed to purchase a VPN. So the state cannot protect its citizens, cannot compensate them when they are harmed, and is even blocking them from filing a compensation claim. All of this is pushing the people's patience to the breaking point and increasing the pressure on Putin to resign. So what can Putin do? Let's look at the options and see where each one leads. Increase repression, the Kremlin's reflex. Protest applications are being rejected, police are knocking on activists' doors, VPNs are being blocked. But societies under pressure explode. Suppressed rage does not disappear, it accumulates. Peskov says, "This is the period we are in," as if it were a temporary situation. But in the 4th year, the word temporary has lost its credibility. Renew propaganda. Turn the Victory Day parade into a scene of national unity. But on those same days, internet in Moscow will be cut. If your phone doesn't work during a victory celebration, what is being celebrated starts to be questioned. Peskov threatens that Ukraine will have to accept harsher terms, but this rhetoric can no longer convince even his own people. New mobilization, the most dangerous option. The 2022 partial mobilization had caused hundreds of thousands of Russians to flee. With approval ratings this low, a second mobilization could be political suicide for the Kremlin. Instead, they are trying to attract volunteers with high salaries and bonuses, but this is also stealing workers from the civilian economy and deepening the already critical personnel crisis. A cycle. Pull workers to the front, factories shut down, economy collapses, discontent rises, apply more pressure. And back to the start. Military retaliation, firing more missiles and drones at Ukraine. But Russia's own air defense network is melting. When winter comes, the entirety of Ukraine's deep strike capacity will be directed at Russian energy infrastructure. And at that point, Moscow's promise of no power cuts will transform from a political joke into reality. Allies. The alliance known as the Krink Axis, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, is throwing Russia a lifeline. Iran and North Korea are providing drones and ammunition. China is giving economic breathing room through energy purchases. But this support is not unconditional. Russia's internal weakness is making its allies nervous. China is calculating the risk of an unstable ally, and Russia's weakness is making Beijing the dominant partner of the alliance. Moscow knows this, but no longer has the strength to prevent it. Historical cycles show us that massive imperial structures and oppressive regimes do not make great noise to the outside just before they collapse. Rather, they rot from within over a long period, silently stretch, their foundational columns weaken, and ultimately collapse into themselves with an unexpected, small tremor. Today, the cold and familiar spectre of the 1917 revolution is wandering again. Not in Moscow's luxury corridors, but in the rage of desperate mothers abandoned to rat-infested basements, in provincial cities whose coffers have been emptied, and in the silent scream of millions of citizens imprisoned in a digital dungeon. The massive military-industrial machine built over years with billions of dollars is no longer grinding the targeted enemy territories. It is mercilessly grinding Russia's own demographics, its own economy, and its own future. The illusion of invincibility and untouchability that had been carefully maintained for so long has now been completely destroyed. The quiet bleeding that had long continued in Russia's vast backyard has now grown to an undeniable scale, an arterial hemorrhage. The rest of the world holds its breath, watching and waiting for the final great fracture and inevitable collapse that this massive geopolitical wreckage, fragmenting from within, will create along the world's fault lines. Now to the heart of the matter, and the ones sounding the alarm aren't only Russian economists, but Western intelligence. In early July, a European state's intelligence report described a banking crisis in Russia as a devastating risk. The reason fits into a single image. The Russian banking system is in the middle of a financial bypass operation. To fund the war, commercial banks were pushed into lending to the front. So the heart, the central bank, keeps pumping fresh money into the system, while the arteries, the banks themselves, are already clogged with loans that will never come back. Pressure comes from outside as well. The European Union's new sanctions wave is severing, one by one, the outside links of more than half of Russia's internationally connected banks. Normally, when a bank stumbles, the state rushes in. This time, the rescuer itself is short of cash, since the same drone campaign is cutting the oil revenue that keeps those banks standing. The state has had to reach into the National Reserve Fund and trim non-war spending. So the cushion that would catch a failing bank thins a little more each day. In economist Igor Lipsitz's phrase, this is only the visible tip of the iceberg, and the iceberg is about to break apart. The most human and most dangerous face of this picture, though, lies in the ordinary depositor's reaction. By analysts' accounts, Russians have lately been pulling cash out of banks at record levels, since trust is gone. People now plainly sense that banks can fail. Nor can we call them wrong. Even a senior figure at one of the country's largest banks was able to say that the collapse of smaller banks outside the top 20 wouldn't be bad for Russia. Yet those are precisely the banks holding the life savings of millions. In such a moment, the first thing that comes to mind is the state's deposit guarantee. Would that guarantee really protect anyone in a genuine collapse? On paper it exists. By analysts' reading, it would be useless. And here the tragedy turns into a vicious circle. The more frightened people are, the more they withdraw. The more everyone rushes for cash at once, the faster the banks fall. Once they fall, most of those savings never come back. It has reached the point where the queues in Russia are no longer only at petrol stations. They stretch outside the banks too. Everyone trying to save their money before it's too late. Recall the black smoke over Omsk from the top of this video. 2,500 kilometers inside the border, one of the deepest blows of the war. What's truly striking, though, isn't a single refinery, but the pattern behind it. Omsk was the last untouched facility among Russia's 11 largest refineries. With it hit, every one of them has now taken at least one strike. If a plant in the middle of Siberia can be targeted, then there is no such thing as a safe rear area anymore. The real weapon is speed. Repairing a refinery takes weeks, sometimes months, while the next strike usually arrives far sooner. Ukraine's drone maker is turning out hundreds of long-range drones a day and plans to push production higher still. So Moscow has to keep its refinery network in an endless repair and breakdown loop. And in that loop, time always works in Kyiv's favor. To see what this crisis means for an ordinary Russian, the petrol stations are enough. Long queues formed outside Lukoil stations in Moscow, and rationing has been introduced in more than 50 regions. The starkest case is Omsk. In the city of that very refinery we just described, drivers were limited to just 40 litres per vehicle while the plant was under attack. The irony of the scene sits right there. A country that fuels the world with its oil is handing out petrol to its own drivers by the litre. In some regions, stations have shut entirely. In others, sales run only at certain hours. The crisis has spread so widely across the country that the city of Irkutsk had to bring in portable toilets for those waiting in line and raise public transport fares. The Moscow refinery, which covers roughly 40% of the capital's fuel, is said to need at least 3 months of repairs, meaning the shortage will run through the summer. The scale of the desperation is given away by a single development. One of the world's largest energy exporters began importing at least 60,000 tons of petrol from India from 1st July to cover the gap. With export bans in force, refineries were even permitted to produce lower-grade fuel. The import is itself an admission. A country that sold fuel to the world for years, now buying petrol from abroad, is the clearest proof of how deep the crisis runs. Nor is it a lasting fix. It's a temporary patch covering only part of the shortfall. Putin has acknowledged the crisis and set up a task force for distribution. Yet in public, he keeps playing the danger down. For the person on the street, this is not a danger to be played down. In some regions, finding fuel locks up daily life. No way to get to work, rising prices, queues that last hours. For an ordinary Russian, the crisis is no longer an abstract headline, but a concrete fact met at the pump each morning. That is what truly unsettles the regime, since economic discontent is the fuel that converts fastest into political unrest. All the more so with September's elections at the door. The panic has its echo at the level of the state too. Even state television's loudest voice, Margarita Simonyan, changed her tone and began preparing the public for austerity. Recalling that in the past, not only petrol but even bread was rationed, she said, "We endured it then and will endure it now. Stop whining." Holding up Soviet-era ration cards instead of a solution gives away the true scale of this crisis all on its own. All these pieces point to one picture, not a sudden collapse, but a slow suffocation. Moscow's military spending, by official figures, runs to roughly 7 to 8% of national income. German intelligence estimates it far higher, nearly 2/3 above the official number, close to 10%. Spending in the first quarter of 2026 rose by about 1/3 year on year. While the weapons plants hum along, the civilian economy is left gasping. The engine of an economy that grows on paper is almost entirely war spending, and civilian demand is weak. The experts' language is hardening as well. The Kiel Institute says Russia's war economy has reached its limits. Another American think tank calls the picture an outright abyss. The timing runs squarely against Russia. The physical destruction is mounting precisely as the revenue that would repair it shrinks. While drones hit the terminals, the price of the Urals crude Russia sells has fallen by roughly 1/3 over the past month, down to the 60s. So Moscow can sell less and gets less for what it does sell. The gold and currency reserves it burns to cover the gap are shrinking in both price and volume. The regime's tactic is a familiar one: delay and look away. Bad loans get restructured, bankruptcies get postponed, the problem gets tossed into the next quarter. This method buys time, yet it enlarges the bill. Deferred debt returns with interest, and blocked bankruptcies pile up. So the crisis deepens not all at once, but with every postponed invoice. Panic is averted in the short run, while the load falls harder on the following year. History warns against such balances. Economies propped up by excessive military spending may look strong in the short term, but they rot from within over the long one. The Kremlin's whole bet is to win the war before that rot completes. The queues at the pumps and the holes in the banks raise the question of whom time is really working against. Moscow still holds cards, of course. Oil revenue, accumulated reserves, tight state control. Every one of those cards is of the melting kind, thinning a little more the longer the war runs. When a country tries to finance both its guns and its butter at once, at some point, it has to cut both. Now let's put both fronts in a single frame. The same drone campaign aimed at the refineries cuts not only the petrol, but the export revenue that sells that petrol and fills the budget. So bread and bank, stomach and wallet come under strain at once. A third arm makes the picture heavier still. The falling world price of oil erodes what export revenue remains. Pump, terminal and price. The bill for pressure from those three directions lands on both the war budget and the ordinary Russian's dinner table. And the most striking part is that all these admissions come from inside the regime. Ostanina from the Duma, Gref from the largest bank, CMASF from among Kremlin-linked economists. In September's Duma elections, this pressure on fuel, bread and prices is very likely to show up at the ballot box. Russia won't collapse overnight. Systems like this wear down quietly, from within. But what we're looking at is not the picture of a healthy economy. And once a regime's own deputies and bankers begin to utter the word defeat this openly, the crack is far deeper than it appears. This is not a prophecy, but an X-ray. And what shows on the film is a patient steadily getting worse. The cause of that decline has a name. A patient siege that Ukraine tightens a little more each night, with the blows going not backward, but ever deeper. In a war now past its fourth year, the one thing that hasn't changed is who pays the heaviest bill: ordinary people. In these very days, Russia struck Kiev, and dozens of civilians lost their lives. So what do you think? Can this two-front pressure force Russia to the table, or will the Kremlin suppress this crisis too and sustain the war for years? Share your thoughts in the comments. To stay informed of PPR Global's exclusive analyses like this, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for choosing us.